Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are coming to the final conference panel here. First of all, I would like to thank the Broadcasting Fee Association for organizing this interesting conference, and especially my thanks to Manfred Kops, who really presented a perfect organization here. You all know the final participants of this panel, as they have already presented their points in this conference. So I will ask them to give very short, maximum of 2-minute statements to questions that have to do with the future of the broadcasting license fee. As everything started with technology, I will first ask Mr. Illgner-Fehns what his conclusions are. He described devices in their heterogeneity. He said boundaries of all kinds blur, but he did not tell us what media convergence, technical convergence, means for the political and legal side. Maybe you got some ideas here.
Well, thank you. First of all, it was very interesting to follow the discussion on the various aspects you have to take in account besides all the technical topics. Looking in the technical field and looking from the market environment, I think the devices get heterogeneous, so it is more and more difficult to bind a specific fee to a specific class of devices. And from that perspective, and what I heard here during the 1.5 days, it sounds that a device-independent fee is more reasonable than a device-dependent fee. And in that respect, I followed very interesting the discussion of Professor Kirchhoff now in his analysis, which is also in favor of such a device-independent fee.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Illgner-Fehns. Next, I will ask Manfred Kops, who presented his approach of comparison here. Comparison means that we see the world as a laboratory. And in fact, there is a high variety in Europe. There are countries with traditional license fee. There are other countries that have abolished the license fee, others that never had a license fee. And there's one country that has two solutions, that is Belgium. In the French-speaking part, they have a license fee, and in the Flemish part, they have abolished it. I think that could only happen in Europe. My question to you, Manfred Kops, what do you think? Is there any country that serves as a future model, as a role model for public service financing?
That's a very complicated question. I would have said until last month, yes, Finland is a country that is the model for the followers. And now I heard that Finland rather is an example for the way the reform of public service broadcasting's financing, or the license fee in particular, should not be managed. And that was also my impression in the report from the other countries, that it needs a much more detailed and time-consuming debate and preparation before you change a model. Because when you do it in times of time pressure, it's even more complicated to find new solutions. I think we all agree that in the long run, a shift from device-based funding to a device-independent, I think maybe citizen-based or even tax-based or household-based funding is necessary for several reasons. But I think before one decides such a model, the discussion we just start here should be intensified, and that makes me a little worried also for Germany, where the discussion will be made very soon, and I'm not sure if all the problems that have to be solved have been reflected sufficiently already.
Yes, thank you very much. The next participant I will ask is Bernd Holznagel. During his presentation, he presented 4 basic principles that are required for a sufficient licensing system. 3 of these have to do with independence. That seems to be the top value. First, independence from state. Second, from the advertisement economy. And third, an independent procedure. Now, Bernd Holznagel, did you find any valid system during the conference and the presentation of many different systems and solutions?
I got the impression that this issue of financing is not a legal one. There is a legal framework, and in Germany there is a strict legal framework because of the constitution. But financing is basically a question of acceptance and of having a workable system. So it's more a question of regulation. And I got the impression here that there is no model, because acceptance, for example, is very different from regions even. I could, after this conference, I could even think about splitting off our German system into different Länder and provinces approaches. I, for example, could imagine that here in this region, North Rhine-Westphalia, it would be probably very easy to get a new fee, a household fee, or we could even stay probably with a license fee because we don't have so many poor people. But in the East, for example, where you have more people, the income is smaller, maybe you have to change there earlier. Or I can also imagine that Berlin, who will produce lots of pirates not willing to pay a fee at all, that they switch on to tax business. I will not make it too complicated, but I'm more in the line with Mr. Kops, that it is difficult to switch very quick. It has to do more than how to say, with the empirical status. And if one really is too quick in changing really models, the risks are enormous. And what we heard from Finland seems to be very clear and support this view.
Thank you very much, Bernd Holznagel. Now this regional license fee you find in Austria, I learned. So even there we have a model. I don't like it because I'm from Hamburg and we are supposed to be a wealthy city. So we have to pay. Yeah, we have to pay more than others. Next will be Wolfgang Schulz. He presented the different systems that are available, and then he talked about problems. He presented an evaluation matrix of what we have to look for when we change the system. But what I also learned is that he sees critical if we exchange a television set fee with a dwelling place fee. So I heard some skepticism out of that. How is that?
You're quite right. I'm not really convinced that we solve the problems when we get rid of the television set as the linchpin or the central point for licensing fee. There are still some problems unsolved, but I've learned that maybe we can solve them. Like in Austria, I've learned that it's not that much of a problem. This thing we talked about with the UK model or the UK problems when the grandmother lives in a flat down the house, you can solve that obviously, but nevertheless I agree with Bernd Holznagel. You have to be very careful when changing a system completely, and the always mentioned Kirchhoff is more present than everybody else here in the room, not physically but intellectually. He said that the household is the right anchor point for a licensing fee, because you have different ways to use television in a household, and so the mixture at the end will justify that the household as such is the thing, and that the person responsible for the household is the one who has to pay the license fee. But I'm not sure, with the different models of living we have, not only traditional families but others as well, that this argument is really valid. And nevertheless, it might be the best for practical reasons, but analytically, I don't think it's the best one.
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang Schulz. The last will be Vincent Porter. You have the microphone. Now, you presented a unique point concerning Britain. Only in Britain we learned that the discussion about the license fee has something to do with technological policy, with the rollout of digital broadcasting. I think this is a unique situation in Europe. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, Mr. Porter?
Thank you, Chairman. Basically, the rollout of digital television was seen by the British government as a form of modernisation of Britain. When New Labour came to power in 1997, modernisation was the buzzword, and conversion of analogue to digital was central to that. They tried it initially in the private sector. Sky Digital, which is private, worked. ITV Digital, which was, as it were, public service broadcaster trying to act in the commercial sector, failed. So they had to switch to a terrestrial platform, and the BBC played a leading role in that. And when its charter was renewed in 2007, it was one of the 7 public purposes for which the BBC was charged. I don't know whether the European Commission ever looked at this as a form of state aid or not, but as far as the BBC was concerned, it entered into a joint venture with transmission companies and other broadcasters, and they agreed to establish this new platform. They would provide additional services. The broadcasters would improve their transmission services, and then they took the license fees from Ofcom, which was the regulator, but for the frequencies, these digital frequencies, of course, they then paid a license fee back to the British government for the use of these additional these additional transmission frequencies. So it was also a new form of taxation of giving money back to the UK government. Rather complicated financial system, but nevertheless it seems to be working, and the digital rollout seems to be on course to finish by the end of 2011.
So you will be the first country, more or less, in the world who finishes digitalization. I would like to ask you one more question. All other participants here talked about the future of the license fee and more or less discussed the household fee. What is the situation there in Britain?
Well, of course, we have a household fee, and there are very few houses which don't have television sets. I haven't seen any particular discussions about having a household fee for people without television sets. I think the problem much more is the level of the license fee, and what will happen in 2011 when the BBC has finished its digital rollout. Will the license fee be reduced, or will there be new technological tasks which will be added to what the license fee actually does? But there's been no discussion that I've really seen on having a license fee for every household, regardless of whether they have a television.
Okay, thank you. Now, the other participants here were primarily discussing the future in terms of the household fee or household tax. And Mr. Illgner-Fehns, you were pretty much in favor of that. So perhaps you can add a few more arguments to overcome the skepticism of Mr. Holznagel and Mr. Schulz.
Okay. Let me take that role. As I said, from the technology environment, from the market environment, how media is used by the technical means you find, and also based on the perspective we will see and we expect in the market, the acceptance of, or my impression is that it is easier to sell the message that you pay a fee for a certain service, a content, rather than that you have to pay a fee because you have a device. And based, at least from a German perspective, the content by the public service providers is highly liked. So the 40%, 43% market share is a huge number. So everyone wants that content. So I think if you, like the Swedish colleagues, try to sell the consumers, and I say intentionally the consumer here, the message here you get a good value for your price. I think you can convince people. Maybe as a note also here, maybe it can help the discussion to analyze what is it that people are not paying, are not accepting to pay. Why is it? And I think also here the colleague, I heard at least from the Swedish colleagues that they investigated this question and found, at least for their environment, an answer. And I would like also to give a side remark to the discussion here. We continue to think about people which are not paying. And think about the percentage ranges. So as an engineering perspective, you will hardly be able to have a 100% perfect system. And if you want to get a 100% effective and perfect system, the cost grows exponentially. So maybe it is helpful in the discussion to see, well, how much can I afford, how much I am willing to pay, and then you get a certain percentage range from a technical point of view, which you will not reach. Maybe this helps also a little bit in the discussion to find out where could be a model which increases and has a very high acceptance. Just some remarks which might help in this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when I listened to Holznagel and Schulz, their argument was not so much legal as it was demographic. You were talking about the withering away of the traditional family household. You're talking about a society that is breaking up and that follows all kind of models, community living, divorces, young people living in the basement with their old family, and so on. Yeah, is it that what makes you skeptical of the household license fee?
Yeah, I think the household license fee might be a good system, but what we don't know yet is what are, for example, the exemptions for the poor. How will you really implement the household fee? Will you send the people sort of into prison if they don't pay? Can you really enforce this by just force? The question is also, Wolfgang Schulz just mentioned it, what is a household? How do you handle this mobile phone business, or that you look on handy TV and so on? I think that is completely missing in the debate, and that is what one really would like to know, how these issues are resolved with a new system. I think this Kirchhoff work, or this Kirchhoff paper, he just answers the question what we actually knew before, that a household fee would be legally, constitutionally possible. It would have been not necessary to write this paper to know this, and I don't know why it was actually Mr. Kirchhoff, especially Mr. Kirchhoff, was asked to write this. But this is another story. I think what is most important is that the paper gives answers to legal issues, and I think the legal issues and questions are very well answered, what I can judge from brief reading. But the major issues are acceptance, how you can force people to pay. You see, there is always an enforcement issue in getting this money. And if it turns out to be in this regard skeptical, that, for example, the young generation or the people are not willing to pay anymore these sorts of fees, then if you would like to stick with public broadcasting, you really have to switch to a tax system, and then you really get the problem of independence from the state. Yeah, and I think Wolfgang has some very good ideas to maybe that you can resolve it with these ideas.
This is an interesting situation anyhow, because this Mr. Kirchhoff, of course, is one of our leading legal scholars. And here we also have two legal scholars, and they both attack Kirchhoff on non-legal matters. They actually say, you know, legally it might be quite good, but think of the society, yeah, and it looks quite different, and it will be difficult to realize and introduce. That's a very interesting argument, Wolfgang.
Already. Yeah, I'm not sure that we are really attacking him, but we just say that it does not solve all the problems, maybe not the main problems we face. A couple of years ago, I would have said tax as a means of finance is out of the question. You can't do that. But the more I think about it, the more I warm for the idea to do that. Maybe I shouldn't tell that in this context, because the institutional guarantee of the GEZ we just had at the end of the last presentation may be in danger when taxation comes into play. But if we can solve the problem of independence from the state, then this might be a good solution, because there is a social component built in. There are means of collecting it, and in Germany we have already the parliaments deciding on the amount of the broadcasting fee, and whether they have a limited, constitutionally limited leeway to decide on that, or on a tax with that specific purpose, which I believe is possible to construe, then that might be a solution. We have it with the church, for example. There is a footnote in this this legal opinion of colleague Kirchhoff talking about this church tax, and says he doesn't want to go into detail with it. But I think we might go into detail when we talk about different solutions.
I think it is a very new argument to say we have a church tax, now we want to have a broadcasting tax, and the churches are quoted in supporting this system. I mean, the broadcasters are not a church.
Yeah, as a non-lawyer, I'm a little surprised that lawyers now are in supporting a tax solution. In other disciplines, they wondered why we do not finance public services or public service broadcasting by taxes. But as I understood lawyers until now, they said that the risk that the state interferes, the government interferes, is so high that although there are advantages, we do not want it, which also can be derived from our experiences with the broadcasting in the past. One thing that would be sympathetic with the tax solution is that then it would not be the household, but it would be the individual finally, or the citizen, which makes more sense to me than to use a household as the final. Yeah, so that's true. But I'm a little skeptical with regard to the other argument, with the state distance. I would like, if I might, come back to what Mr. Illgner said concerning that it is easier to convince people to pay for service or content than to pay for the possession of a device set. I see that there are big problems at the devices become very hybrid. It's hard to identify them or to identify if somebody possesses one. But I also see that the difficulty is to convince people that the service, we talk about public service, broadcasting service, is valuable. If I look at the younger generation, they do not watch public service broadcasting. They also do not use much audiovisual services from the public service broadcasters. They do not really evaluate positively the specific, let's say, public orientation or public function of public service broadcasters. So that also has a lot of problems. And what Dr. Schulz mentioned yesterday is that public service broadcasting, in its contribution for a free public communication, is a public good. That has a consequence that public goods never can be financed individually, voluntarily. But as a public good, you need a public enforced revenue for that, even in time of convergence.
Mr. Porter, you wanted to comment to our arguments?
Yes. I think two things. First, there's a danger of the debate merging into a form of idealism, which we need to be careful about. But my other point was that although there has been no discussion in Britain of a household tax, there has been discussion, or at least it's been advanced, of having a subscription. That is, to remove the license fee completely and have a subscription. And of course, with the advent of a digital terrestrial platform, which can be universally received, it's now technically possible to have a subscription system. And there are a number of people on the right wing in Britain who advocate that the license fee should be abolished and replaced by a subscription system. And of course, the move to the digital platform makes this technologically possible.
Yes, thank you very much. Any comments here? Of course, if you want to participate in the discussion, please raise your hand and we will include you in this panel. No comments at this time? Yes, Mr. Illgner.
Maybe I can throw in another, maybe a little bit provocative aspect, following the concept on UK and the BBC funding. We have intense debates about fostering our economy and the Germany being a place for economical growth and the leadership in also the kinds of technology, right? On the other side, we fell short in really driving the development, so getting really something done and stimulating far ahead developments. Most of the technologies we see today in the so-called CE market are coming from outside Germany. So maybe it could be a thought following the concept of UK and BBC to say, well, why not use the public service broadcast as it has been in the past as a driver for the installation of new infrastructures? Well, if you look, for instance, in the color TV, the public service provider started it and initiated a huge development of companies around this sector. I know I may be a little bit provocative as a statement, but maybe it could also help a little bit thinking a little broader and a little bit in a larger context what a fee for public services can all establish and steer and trigger in the whole economy.
Well, that's a very interesting argument. Sometimes I feel that Germany attempts to be a dictatorship of engineers. They tell us in which direction to go, and this stuff, like China, and only the Chinese do it better, because since color TV, which was in 1967, all these attempts failed. And for example, digital radio was a big deal here 10 years ago, and then it pretty much died away. But it is an interesting position. You have something to say about that, Mr. Holznagel?
There will be. I think we are living in a time where paradigms change. And I think during the last 20 or 30 years, everybody relied on the market. And if, for example, if you, what Mr. Vincent Porter pointed out, we all faces the problem that we have to build new nets. I think we need glass fiber nets everywhere. And in the rural areas, the market will not bring these new fiber nets. So there is a clear role for the state to take active steps. I think there are here a lot of countries, I think Finland too, or in the north, that the state is probably much more active. And if I speak about the state, I also speak about communities, cities, and so on. It's from my view part of the state. I think there is a big shift in telecommunications because 10 years ago or even longer, we made our law in a way that we were arguing we have to privatize the telecommunication sector. That worked to enforce competition. But now when you have to rebuild infrastructure, you get a problem. And I think in this line, the view of you could also bring up new innovative thoughts.
Okay, that's an active infrastructure policy of the state. Like in many other European states, we had a withdrawal during the last 20 years from active media policy, leaving it to the market. Now it's the way back. I'm also impressed that both participants here who were of different opinion before now feel that this is the right strategy. What I see is, as long as the money is not provided, and here we're talking about license fees, it's not easy to distribute money that you don't have. So perhaps we come back to the point somebody has to pay for all of that.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's interesting to look at a problem which spreads across the whole of the European Union. About 5 or 6 years ago, we had a policy of an information economy which was going to arrive in 2010. It's now 2010. It hasn't really arrived. It's beginning to splutter into life. Europe generally has a major problem of creating employment. And the question of rolling out high-speed electronic infrastructure offers the possibility of creating employment, not only of engineers, but also of ordinary roadsmen who will dig up the roads and lay the new cables. But as yet, of course, we don't know precisely what's going to go down those pipes. But there is a sort of general rhetoric that one sees increasingly widely that the private sector and innovation and information, if they are given these new networks, will actually provide a way of providing services and making money.
Yeah, Wolfgang Schulz wants to react to that.
Maybe a different complexion put on the same issue. I'm a little reluctant when it comes to using the public service broadcasters as tools of infrastructure policy. But nevertheless, what I find extremely interesting is that the BBC was somehow successful in arguing that they are not only competitors for the private, but also opening markets, not only when it comes to technology, but also other things. I had once the privilege to talk with people from BBC Worldwide, so the commercial side, and they showed me some news magazines they publish and have been publishing for a couple of years, gardening magazines, cooking, and so on. And they argued there have been no gardening magazines before we started it. And now there are 5, one of them, and published by them, and 4 by commercial entities. And so everybody is happy with that. And to this attitude that public service broadcasting can open market and enable business, it's something completely new for German thinking, I believe. And maybe that is an approach, but nevertheless to use the public broadcasters for infrastructure policy that failed without them, I think that's not the right approach.
I think it's an interesting argument that the public service remit includes gardening magazines. Sure.
We know that the market only provides services when it can make profit, and we have, on the one hand, we have situations where the market cannot reach the critical mass. We always had that, and where the state had to start up, had to give state money that the markets could be enabled to work. And we also know that maybe the last 20% of service are too expensive. That's why we have public service functions, not only for broadcasters. What I also wouldn't like is that public service broadcasters should pay for these niches or these parts of services that cannot be provided by the market. That would mean we as license fee payers would pay to enable market companies to make money for those where it is not profitable from the market rules themselves. On the other hand, these arguments are right that the state has an obligation to enable market there, but that would have the consequence that we should fund public service broadcasters for their public service broadcasters programs mission from the license fee, and what the public service broadcasters do to complete infrastructures, for instance, should be financed by tax money. These are different charts, and they should result in different structures of funding. Makes it very complicated. We would have two different budgets of public service broadcasters functions. One would be financed from the state, tax money. The other would be financed from the license fee payer. Your argument is right, that always public service broadcasters have had this collective public task and fulfilled it, and that's a legitimate task. But the function, the question how to fund this has to be added.
Well, when I looked into German media policy and also European media policy, I realized that the public service organizations were prime movers in new technologies as long as they had a monopoly. As soon as the market was opened, there was a number of players, including hardware, software, media companies, technology actors, and so on. And now it is much more difficult on this diffused market to initiate new developments. But that's just my argument.
Yeah, I would like to take up an argument of Vincent Porter. I think the problem we will face in, let's say, 5 years or so is that we will sort of build a glass fiber infrastructure. And on this glass fiber infrastructure, you can distribute services from, I don't know, 1 gigabyte or even 10 gigabyte. So there is an enormous space available on these new pipes. And what I'm worried a little bit is that we are building up the pipes for Google and Apple services. Because with these new devices and these new apps and so on, they are a little bit, or they are in front and sort of being very, very good in the service market. And in the service area, we are not so good. Europe has a, how did you call it, a problem with creative industries. And I think that problem has to be faced. And it can probably be faced, or a part of a strategy to resolve this problem is that we develop new devices maybe in order to, for example, to fulfill the vision you had that broadcasting is still in place in the future, but you need specific devices so that broadcasting can be delivered on the screen. That was the issue, who is sort of getting the screen. These are just ideas. I don't have a strategy, but there is a clear danger that you have these glass fiber pipes, you have lots of space, but there is no European content to fill. And that should not be happen, that we take now tax money to build up the pipes, and then the business is being made by global firms that are not located in Europe.
Yes, I think that's a very valid argument, that the public service broadcasters disappear on the broadband because there are thousands of other offerings, and many of them, of course, will come from Hollywood and other parts of the world. Mr. Illgner-Fehns, you started this whole discussion. Defend yourself.
Okay. Well, I tried to kick it a little bit off. So for that reason, I was a little provocative. Maybe first to get one perspective with respect to you, Dr. Schulz, right? So it is not that you can do something in the market by whatever money against market forces. So that is for sure. So you cannot just do something and then hope it will work. So that was not my intention. But I think Professor Holznagel brought up a very, very important topic. And we had it already raised in the context of the broadcast license fee. It's about services. What we want and what we need to provide and what we need to be able to offer are attractive services. And the services center around the content which is being produced, created in the broadcast stations. And that they have to be brought, well, we built now the infrastructure that you get this content to the consumers, but you must be able still that this content is also accessible and has a reasonable visibility to the consumers. And if you leave this field to the international global competition, well, then you endanger the broadcast service system, not because of a lack of acceptance internally, but just because of the market forces and the competition forces in the global markets. And from that perspective, maybe here the pieces fit very nicely together. The concept of building an infrastructure, the perspective and the story, the marketing story to the citizen as a consumer. I want to get that service on my infrastructure, and maybe this helps to sell it also, and to bottom line create the acceptance, which is to my mind and my understanding in this 2 days here the heart where we fail short and what was the center of the problem we are discussing. It's not a matter of the model, it's a matter of acceptance. How you create acceptance, I think here this is a very good and very important topic you brought up.
Next contribution will be by Vincent Porter.
Thank you, Chair. As the discussion unrolls, it occurs to me, suppose, for instance, the public service broadcasters of Europe were to develop their own search engine. The BBC had a plan to develop its own search engine, but it didn't proceed with it. I think I'm right in saying, although I'm not entirely sure, that the European Commission said it was an illegal use of state aid to finance a search engine when search engines like Google already existed. But if one is actually going to establish a broadband network and have these fibers all over Europe, then the question is, how do you actually encourage people to find their way around them? Development of a search engine would be actually a very interesting idea.
Yes. Next will be Manfred Kops.
That's an interesting case. I just tried to construct an analogy to if the European Commission would say public service broadcasters are not allowed anymore as we have private broadcasters now. That would be the same argument as to say we have Google already, so we need no public service broadcasters search engines anymore. The point is that a public service broadcaster's search engine would be a different type of search engine than a commercial one. I would say that it would be as legitimate then. But of course, it's not easy to convince the European Commission from such a way to evaluate these plans. But I wouldn't, as strictly as you did, say this is a discussion that has been decided already or has been decided properly.
Any more contributions on the panel to this? Okay, thank you. We are coming to the end, but Mr. Kops asked me to conclude this conference with a few final remarks. The conference was on the future of the broadcasting license fee, and in general we heard that it is in danger. In all countries that were presented here, we heard more or less alarming reports. The old system does not work properly, and we have no clear new solutions. Somebody talked about a lethal cocktail that he is confronted with. Mr. Illgner-Fehns started out in explaining to us that we clearly have media convergence on a technical side, which of course does not mean that this convergence also happens economically, politically on the consumer side, but increasingly we have to be confronted with it sooner, as we heard, in the north of Europe, later in the south in Italy. There seem to be a few years until it really hits. Vincent Porter talked about the contradictions of the European Union requirements, some strange developments in competition policy, and also I think the European Union policy is not always straightforward. It can be opportunistic. It can be, like every policy, changing over years. Bernd Holznagel presented some basic principles that have to be watched for when we introduce new license fee policies, and his basic principles include the protection of independence of the public service system on the political side, on the economic side, and also on the side of fixing the license fee. Representatives of different collection agencies here in Europe presented their information about the ways of collecting, which of course is very diverse on the continent, and we also heard about benchmarking and the models that are available. Freddie Lusford this morning presented his experiences in Norway, where a new report was put out, and if I understand it correctly, the argument goes in the direction of a household tax. Marco Alafossi from Finland described the drama that is going on in his country, where already a household fee was decided upon, and now it is back in the political arena. Matthias Ramsauer from Switzerland told us that a device independent fee is recommended in his country, and a new system might be in place to be introduced in 2013. Fulvio De Nunzio from Italy, he explained to us that the biggest problem are the evaders. Well, that's our stereotype of Italy anyhow. 26% who are not paying, and so you're not so much confronted with media convergence problems as with getting the money, so to say, in the mainstream broadcasting field. Adalbert von Gramm from Germany, of course, reacted to the recent Kirchhoff report, and he demonstrates that it is important to have a new way of financing public service that hopefully is connected with less harassment, less costs, and more acceptance in the society. Also, Wolfgang Schulz presented his ideas about financing public service, and we got his skeptical ideas. So he finally ends up with this very interesting church tax proposal. Anyhow, all the people who are here from the association, your job is to secure the financial basis of public service broadcasting systems. And let me say a few sentences about this. Public service broadcasting is a unique European invention. It should be seen as part of European heritage, and it has provided the continent with excellent radio, television, and increasingly online services. And because of this, it is important to maintain and secure this system. Even though the European Commission might not know this, it is a core part of European identity. It was invented in Britain and also in Scandinavia, and even before the Second World War, it was exported to British Commonwealth countries, to Canada, to Australia, and South Africa, that is also a member now of your association. Later, after the Second World War, it was introduced all over Western Europe, often as part of democratization of these countries, like in Germany and Spain and other places. With the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, public service was extended into Eastern Europe. Again, it was part of the transformation process from a state and party-controlled broadcasting system to an open civil society system. It might not always be finished, this process. We all know that politicians are attempting to intervene into public service broadcasting, but it certainly is much better than everything we had before. Traveling around the world, I realized that people in many countries outside of Europe are very interested in the public service experience in Europe as a model that they feel should also be introduced in their country. I realized that in Taiwan, for example, where in recent years a new public service television system was built up. I had discussions in Latin America, in Chile and Venezuela, for example, where people asked us from Europe, we have a totally commercial system, so there is little general information, political information, cultural information in it, and very interesting, often it is polarized. So the different political powers transfer their interests into the different commercial actors. I also want to remind you that in the United States, which has no public service tradition, now we have a general polarized political situation that is also reflected in the media system. So there are the anti-Obama people using Fox News very successfully, and there is a pro-Obama channel with MSNBC. So again, the integration effect of public service broadcasting is missing here. So let me conclude and say, you in this association that has organized this panel, you are in fact of the highest importance to secure the financial basis of this public service system, public service broadcasting that has been and should be in the future part of the core identity of Europe. Okay, thank you very much. I will conclude with this. I thank the panel participants and I wish you a good way back to your home.